Meanwhile, the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has announced that the government is going to practice tough love with SOEs and that the restructuring of SOEs is a priority. During his medium-term budget statement, Godongwana said government is prepared to let go of some state-owned enterprises. He says they're committed to avoiding further bailouts of SOEs over the next 3 years. Busi Sibeko is Economist at the Institute for Economic Justice. Thank you so much for joining us, Busi. Much appreciated. So the minister says over the next 3 years, they will let go of some SOEs that are no longer considered strategically relevant. What do you understand by this statement?
No, thank you for that question. I think fundamentally there are two things that are of concern here. The one is that what kind of participation, oversight and accountability will be exercised in deciding which quote-unquote SOEs are no longer relevant. I think it is critical that as a nation, we get a say into which ones we do not think are viable or the ones that we do not think are strategic anymore. I think it is important that we go back to the historic reasons, the social economic reasons why state-owned entities exist, which ones are still relevant in our current context, and which ones need to be, transformed. When we think about the post office, for example, what kind of transformations are needed to make it relevant in our current context doesn't mean that it is no longer relevant or important. It just means that it hasn't kept up to the time, and there's ways in which government will actually need to invest some resources in helping the postnet, for example, to transform into a utility in which we can say this is a state-owned entity that is of relevance in our current context and responds to the needs that we have, given its relative importance, for example, to the grant system in itself. And so I think it is very critical that we think about the accountability, oversight, participation mechanisms in which these decisions are going to be made, and cannot be a unilateral decision within government itself.
So, Busi, I'm glad that you raised that because, I mean, there are different policy proposals by political parties on what to do with SOEs. While some are seeking to nationalize it, some say you need to privatize some state-owned entities. But what does it mean to the public when you talk about relevance, especially in terms of the global trend? SOEs are growing in importance. So at what point do we make this decision? And what does it mean to willingly or let go willingly? Does it mean 100% privatization of state-owned entities?
I mean, not necessarily, right? So the research has mixed results. So there are countries that have privatized SOEs and that has led to really detrimental outcomes. And then there's other countries that have pursued private-public partnerships. And I think in our context, specifically, we need to think deeply about what it means for private-public partnerships and what that means for the SOEs themselves, and whether government will be bearing the costs of de-risking investment into those SOEs for private sector. So there are real concerns around that, to say that what are the context-specific solutions to SOEs that we need in our country. And not just because something has been done in another country doesn't mean that it will necessarily work in South Africa. So it requires for analysts, for economists, for public sector specialists to really take seriously the question of context. What will work is ultimately the question. And sometimes it seems as though privatization is the way out, but it's not necessarily a good thing. And I think sometimes we put this, false dichotomy between private sector efficiency and public sector efficiency. That is not always necessarily true. And there's a reason why state-owned entities exist to begin with. There are goods that need to be provided through the public sphere, right? There are public goods and services. And we have to ask ourselves that question: what is the role of the state fundamentally in providing goods?
Is there a framework when it comes to SOEs, ownership policies, ownership models, creation and termination, and particularly aggregate reporting on it, so that we understand that at what point are we saying state-owned entities no longer are public companies, or what rules apply?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's a missing piece, right? To say that in government saying this in this MTBPS, they haven't explicitly said when we consider SOE bailouts, we'll engage the public in this way. And that is a very critical concern, right? To say that what say do, people living in South Africa have over what decisions are made over state-owned entities in itself is a political question that we have to really answer. And I think, as always, the question is always around what kind of meaningful, and not just any, but meaningful public participation would be part of this process of decision-making. And again, like I said, it cannot be a unilateral decision that says, hey, such and such SOE is not performing. And just to remind the listeners to say that state-owned entities were not designed for profit making. So we also need to rethink our approaches to state-owned entities. We should be happy if they are breaking even. That is the purpose, right? It's not for profit maximization like we think of in a capitalistic system, but to say they are essential goods and services.
Busi, before we run out of time, let's talk about SOEs in a marketplace. So the finance minister stressed that state-owned companies are intended to be important enablers of economic development, but many have been badly managed and have failed to deliver. So to your view, which fall within this category, because we've been talking about Eskom, a lot of criticism thrown its way, but it still continues to be a significant risk for the fiscus.
Absolutely. And I think what I would have to say to that is that there's a failure to actually resolve the problems that are facing that state-owned entity itself. And because we are failing, government is failing to respond to the issues, it doesn't mean that it must be privatized. So it is critical to distinguish this idea of the state-owned entity is no longer relevant and needs to be privatized, and the state-owned entity is important, but we haven't been able to resolve the issues, and therefore we need to work harder. And I think our government has to commit to say that Eskom is a critical national asset, and we need to think about it differently. We need to think about how to resolve the management issues. We need to think about how to resolve its debt issues. We need to think about how to invest in green energy or green transition, just transition within Eskom, which would require fiscus in itself to step in the, in the event that there's no investment in that sector. And so I think we really fundamentally need to think differently about what is the problem and what is the resolve without necessarily just quickly jumping to privatization as a solution, just because it's the seemingly easy route out of the problem.
Busi, hopefully you'll be available for a longer, more in-depth discussion about this. I think it's a very important topic and does need a plurality of views. Thank you so much, Busi Sibeko, economist at the Institute for Economic Justice.